Hello and welcome to the Society with Barrister Fatma Shaheen at PTB World. Islam mandates us to be kind and respectful towards our parents. When we talk about Pakistani culture, when we talk about Pakistani societal norms, they also stress on the same. Despite this, unfortunately, in the recent past, we have seen not one, in fact, quite a few incidents surfacing on social media where we have seen children brutally assaulting, torturing their parents, forcing them to leave the house. Why then is this the case? This is exactly what we'll be talking about in our today's show. We'll also be talking about this new law which has now been brought into place, which actually gives parents rights. It gives them protection from not being evicted from their houses. How effective will such laws prove in order to curtail this social evil? And last but not the least, what impact do such untoward incidents actually have on both the parents who are evicted as well as on children, be it in an emotional manner, be it in a psychological manner, or be it at a very basic social level? This is what we'll be talking about in our today's show, and to do that, let me introduce you to my today's panel. My first panelist for the show today is Sheikh Jahangir Mahmood Saab, who's an Islamic scholar. Assalamu alaikum, sir, and welcome to the show. My second panelist for the show today is Zain Ashraf, who is a social worker. Assalamu alaikum ji and welcome to the show. And my third panelist for the show today is Ms. Jannat Fazal, who is a clinical psychologist. Assalamu alaikum Jannat and welcome to the show. Sir, I would like to start the conversation with you. You know, something which I just mentioned in the introduction too, that our religion places a lot of stress when it comes to looking after parents, when it comes to being respectful towards them, more so in their old age when they are more vulnerable. So as an Islamic scholar, sir, how do you define the scope and contours of this obligation which has been placed on Muslim children?
Yes, I do agree that things are changing and not for the good necessarily. The problem is that I feel that not just Islam, but all societies, almost all societies and cultures and religions do give a lot of importance to looking after the elderly parents. Islam more so, because it places that responsibility as a religious obligation that must be answered for in the next life. However, this is actually a cycle of affairs. It starts with the parents' upbringing, and that upbringing results in a certain kind of children. And when those children get older and the parents get old, then the responsibility kicks in actually. Now, I think what's going wrong today with abandonment is that somewhere along this line, that transfer of that feeling and the obligation of parenting, I think that is also to blame for this gap.
Right, sir. But you know, I think that is something on which I will take Jannat Sahiba's reference, because I think she has that benefit of dealing with such cases and she can of course give us a psychological, you know, narrative on that too. But when we talk about the contours and the scope of this responsibility, now we do see people, you know, everybody has different reasons for trying to justify why they are neglecting their parents, which of course should not be done. How do we then define the contours of this responsibility? Are there some, you know, defining lines? Because, you know, for example, a woman in a society, when she gets married, she has other responsibilities as well, to look after her husband, to look after her in-laws, to basically, you know, bring up her children too. So how then does she basically balance such responsibilities?
The contours and the parameters are almost absolute, especially for the male child. But in case someone does not have children, male children to look after sons, like in our society, obviously this falls upon the daughters themselves. Now the daughter is already out of the house, and then she has to perhaps, you know, travel back and forth, and the responsibility of the daughter is not absolute as is on the son as per the Sharia. That is much lesser responsibility.
This is exactly what I wanted you to tell us, exactly.
She is not obligated in the same fashion as the male son is, because he is the actual heir. With that status of being the male also comes great responsibility for what they have to do. Looking after parents is one of them. And I think that when we speak about how this can actually work with, I think we need to build a better society in general. I think sons-in-law should not look for the legal obligation towards parents-in-law.
I think the morality, the social element, so as to, you know, counteract in the event that, you know, daughters can't do it because of their other obligation, which of course per se doesn't absolve them of this responsibility, because of course they are their parents at the end of the day. Coming to you, Zain Saab, you know, being the youngest on the panel today here, How do you see young adults like yourself in Pakistan actually, looking after their parents, being obedient to them, more so when they grow old? Because we do see trends, unfortunately, so quite a few incidents have also surfaced on social media where we saw that, this young person, he was beating up his mother brutally just because, his wife didn't get along with her.
I would also like to recall upon my own experiences while I was growing up. I have always seen my father taking care of my grandmother when she was alive, and he was always giving her enough time and taking care of her and everything. I really believe so is that what you can't tell your kids what to do. You really have to show them what you really have to do, because kids never listen to you if you're trying to preach them with words.
You have to show it by your actions.
Exactly. You have to integrate your lives within their lives, and that can only happen with actions, not with words. And that is the I feel that is the case right now in this society, that we are somehow more indulged in our social lives and we are giving less time to our family and cultural values. I think we are not giving enough time to our parents as well as our kids at the same time, and we are not able to follow the family values that were inculcated from our parents and grandparents, and we're not maybe giving proper time to our kids in a way so they can also inculcate the same values that we inherited. Unfortunately, there's also been so much urbanization that old people used to sit down with their friends, community members, and have good time in the evening, and there were less issues. And now, since the urbanization, everybody is so busy in today's world that we're giving less and less time to our family.
But coming to you, Jannat, how do you see this from a psychological perspective? Have the reasons that he has mentioned, do they justify the fact that young people should get away with not looking after their parents, especially in old age?
Thank you for having me
You're
on the
most
show, Fatma. I'd like to agree with what my colleagues have mentioned here. We have to understand why it's happening here, why anybody is doing this. There's so many determinants. Yes, children learn vicariously. So if you're not giving your parents time, if you're not spending time with your children, they're not going to have that bond with you. They're not going to want to spend that time with you. If you're in your young, when your children are young, you cannot spend time with them. You want to you come back from work, you have other obligations, and then you meet your children on weekends.
Right, Jannat.
Then you don't expect your children when they get old to be there for you every day.
That's true. I agree with what you're saying, but I also slightly disagree, because I do think there is, not in all cases, but this is something which is very peculiar to our Eastern culture, looking after our parents and going that extra mile, keeping the family institution strong, having that traditional joint family set up at the end of the day.
It's very important that we sort of define what is Western influence. What we are trying to say is that if somebody does not want to live in a joint family system, if somebody wants their space, if somebody is aware of their right to privacy, we cannot say that it's a Western concept. It's just their right they're asking for. That was sort of deprived.
No, but on the
they were deprived
contrary,
of.
you're right. But on the contrary, if you've had parents who've looked after you all their lives, put or whatever they had to give you a good education, to get you married off, then it's only fair for them to expect that you give them a reasonable amount of care when you grow old. So I think to each their own at the end of the day. And it basically depends on the circumstances of every case.
There can be many determinants, and also we have to understand that the parent-child relationship is not transactional. And if we cannot think of it as a transaction, parents should not think of their children as an investment that they're going to take care of them, eventually in the future. I understand that there has to be certain obligations, they have rights and everything, but this should not be taken as that. And earlier we were discussing that how we can change this.
Do you feel, as a psychologist, is there any correlation between the fact that if you don't have a very strong relationship with your parents from the outset, this may be a contributory factor to you neglecting them when they grow old?
I wouldn't say that neglect them. I would say that sometimes you need space. Sometimes you want to get away from a toxic environment. It can be created by your parents. It can be also created by extended family living there. So it's just, you want to put some space between your parents. Does not mean you don't love them. Does not mean that you wouldn't want to help them. But in our culture, we tend to think that if the the children are not living with their parents, they're not taking care of their parents.
Right.
We have to understand that they can also take care while living separate.
Right, Jannat, your point is noted. But coming to you, sir, I think she has basically given us, circumstances where she does feel that children, if they want, they can take space. But I personally see, you may beg to differ with me on this, that a lot of times such cases of neglect, of completely letting your parents out, evicting them from the house, so to speak, can be neglected if the relationship is strong, or for that matter, if this abuse is something which is taken care of timely at the end of the day. So in Islam, how do you see this, emancipating? How do you see this being laid down that, if, for example, an adult person doesn't get along with their parents, rightly or wrongly so, then how can they sort this out amicably?
You see, Islam does give this, the Sharia laws give this this issue of emancipation from the parents. If the parents' relationship is that toxic, it's not an impractical religion.
Right.
And we have rulings regarding this as well. But what Islam proposes or insists on rather is what we call ihsan or excellence, that even if someone treats you badly, you don't have to treat them back like that. So let's say if somebody's parents were not good parents to them, or they were too overpowering or suffocating or whatever,
Right.
now that they are in a weaker position, so it is almost, let's call it obligatory, not to repeat that cycle. Because like I resonate with what Zaid said, that children listen with their eyes. So they're going to see you doing that. They're not going to understand, your children, that you were treated badly, or you were mentally or
Right.
verbally or physically abused as a child. They're going to repeat that same behavior.
Right.
So this chain has to stop. And to stop it, this action of ihsan, of not giving bad in return for bad, this must stop.
So, sir, this should then ideally speaking, coming from both the parties, because if the relationship is not that strong, or if it has that element of distrust, and it is not that ideal relationship, then I think equally then both parties should work to make it right, rather than things getting out of control. So my question then is, then the responsibility is divided between the children as well as the parents. What is your viewpoint on this?
I think that the responsibility is certainly divided, yes, on paper, but in practice, it's more about power.
Right.
Like in almost every relationship. So it's end of the day, it's how much the person holds power over the other that's going to decide the equation. So that definition comes from actually practical doing it. What I think that kids need to do today is to, if they do feel bad about it, they should start the act of forgiving them.
Right, so your point is noted. But coming to you, Zan, we understand the fact that this very progressive piece of law has recently been passed by the government, in which, it is now not permissible for parents, to be kicked out this way of their houses. And in the event that they do, they can take legal action. And on the contrary, if the parents don't want any particular child to live with them, they can, of course, pursue a case that way. And they can also, serve an eviction notice to the respective child and have them, move out. So on paper, at least, this law seems very progressive. But as a young person yourself, how do you see it being implemented in practice?
All right. I think it's a very ideal scenario to be in place in Pakistan, and it is very important to safeguard the rights of the parents and giving a roadmap to the kids also.
Right.
But to follow that roadmap, we need an ecosystem to support that
Right.
barrier. One that is, I think, A is awareness. We need to create awareness among the kids in the family system. B, we need to create sustainable livelihood for the family system. Third, we need to create rehabilitation programs for such families who are going through such circumstances.
Right, basically. So at the end of the day, they are integrated back into the
Yes.
society, even if they are left out.
Yes.
I think awareness is something I would want you to further deliberate upon. Awareness of who, whom, and through what medium.
I think it's very important for us to understand that it's not just the legal awareness, it's also how that children have rights and obligations, and parents also have rights and obligations.
Right.
And that needs to be inculcated. How to communicate to each other, that is also very important. Because even if they, use law and stay in the same,
House.
space or same house, at the end of the day, they won't have that. It's going to be a toxic space.
Basically, they could be emotionally abusing their parents.
Yes,
And they
and-
could still be living with them.
Yes,
Right.
and you don't want that kind of toxicity in a household where you're living, because then it's not going to be good for your well-being, right? So it's important that they're aware that how to talk to each other and relay that emotional, whatever they're feeling, the distress that they're experiencing from each other, they need to relay that to each other.
Right.
So that
I
can
think
be
the
sorted.
communication at the end of the day has to be very strong.
Yeah.
But from your experiences of being a psychologist yourself, how do you understand, how do you put down the psyche of those who actually commit such acts? Tell their parents to leave the house, evict them out. Are there certain characteristics? Are there certain do they have a particular mindset towards their parents or towards life, which makes them more prone to doing such things?
So as already mentioned, children learn vicariously. Right? So if they've seen you doing it, they're going to repeat it because they don't know any other way. So you cannot, expect them to break that cycle because they don't know any other way. So you have to be a good role model for them to follow it. And if, there can be cases in which children just do not want to live with their parents, or they are, they're hurtful towards their parents. You have to, at the end of the day, as a parent, need to ground your children, ethically and morally.
Right.
You have to inculcate values so that, eventually they can follow those.
And then
They
values
have a
itself
roadmap.
becomes very subjective, Jannat, at the end of
Yeah,
the
but
day,
at the-
basically,
yeah.
depending on the kind of family you belong to, the exposure you
Yes.
have, the society we
Yes.
live in, so many other things,
Yeah,
and the
yeah, yeah,
exposure that the child themselves have too,
Yeah, but
at the end.
you have to try to do your best so that, and give them exposure. Do not smother them in any way, but it's where you talk about your rights, you talk about your obligations as well. And you be there for them so that they can follow that.
Right.
You are a good role model, and then they will follow because they just learn vicariously.
Right.
And
So basically, to answer my question and for the benefit of the audience too, there are no particular characteristics or there's no particular mindset which makes you more prone to doing such things.
There isn't.
Right,
There isn't.
right.
There isn't one characteristic, one determinant as to this person
It's
is
an
going to...
amalgamation of so many external things.
So many
to speak.
things, and because this is a capitalist world that we're living in.
Right.
So we want everyone to be in one way or the other productive. So if somebody is non-productive, we tend to think that we're better off without them. Not saying people tend to think this way, but this is also a determinant.
Right.
So all these things need to be understood
in a very holistic manner,
yeah,
so to speak,
yeah.
right? Your point is noted. But sir, coming to you, we've generally spoken about the law with Zain. How do you feel is this law in line with our Islamic injunctions, Islamic teachings?
Obviously, in principle, the law is very much in line with Islamic teachings. Nothing against Islam in that law. However, if I could elaborate on what Zain said very well, but spoke very well. The thing is, you cannot change society by laws. Society is transformed through social engineering. And that social engineering, part of which is the ecosystem, we mentioned before, that has to be created first. And yes, on the fringes of that system, on the fringes of the ecosystem, there are going to be people who will need laws to put them in their place. And for that fringe, you need the law. But for the change, law enough is not.
No, of course, sir, but on the contrary, if you look at so many things, laws generally come to change societal attitudes, be it this issue of leaving, your parents, evicting them out of the houses, be it any other issue. We have laws to cater to every social issue, so to speak, not only in Pakistan but world over. But you're right, of course, that to enforce them more effectively, we have to have an ecosystem out there. One more thing I would want you to particularly draw on is the fact that, when we talk about old homes, that is something on which people, generally have two schools of thought. There is one school of thought which says that, it's okay to have old homes because if, elderly people, they don't have anywhere to go in the event that they are evicted out of their houses, they should have a second home. And on the contrary, there is this school of thought that, if you have more of such old homes in our society, then this will actually encourage more children to send their parents to old homes just because they feel that they can't look after them, rightly or wrongly so. So, is there any concept of old homes in our religion?
I think that we need to introduce that into our lives in our society. And I believe that if we think this through without being too emotional about it, I think an old home with the new definition, is very much a facility which I could take. For example, if I were a working person and my wife is a working person, and we two are only there, we're getting old ourselves, but we have extremely elderly parents, and they need medicines 6 times a day, they need to check their blood pressure 4 times a day, and to be generally be observed about how they're walking and how they're eating, enough or not. I think it would be a great facility, not as an eviction and abandonment,
Right.
but as in a facility to make my life easier, like you send children to school. A working woman needs to send her kids to a daycare.
It should be basically inculcated as a way of life.
In a positive way. The thing is that in previous society, before capitalism came into play, there was no need for an old home actually. You see, there was an old home, but in the same meaning as today, not in the same meaning. For example, we had elderly people looked after by someone, by their children. If they had no children, they would go to their brothers or relatives. I have seen in my youth, say even 35 years ago,
Right.
elderly people living with very distant relatives who had no one to look after them, or who had no one fit enough financially or otherwise to look after them. So previously, though Islam has always had this concept of caring, it's going to be by your direct relatives, by your society in general, and if perhaps you need to do it in the modern world, I think Islam and Muslim law is very comfortable with having an old home as a facility for those who have no one to look after them.
Right, sir, your point is noted. But coming to you, Jannat, you know, when we talk about sending parents to old homes, what are the most glaring psychological effects on, you know, old elderly people who are actually sent to such old homes? Because not everybody complains that, you know, they are unhappy. I, for a fact, know quite a few old people who've happily gone to old homes, considering that, you know, they were not well looked after at their homes, or the circumstances were such that, you know, they preferred going to the old home and living there as opposed to staying with their children.
So it comes down to whether you get a choice about it or not. If you're choosing it for yourself, of course you're going to be happy about it, because there are a lot of people who do not have children. There are women, widowed women who do not have children, they have nobody else, and they choose to live there. That's okay. They pay for themselves, they live there, they get all the facilities, and they're taken care of. On the other hand, if this is something which is imposed on you, then how, you know, anything which gets imposed on anyone, how does it make you feel? It makes you feel unwanted, abandoned. It makes you feel
Depressed.
lonely and depressed, yes, and that follows. So yeah, of course, then they're going to feel all those things. But as Sir also already mentioned, that it can also be a blessing, because elderly do not have that social support system in Pakistan. We used to have it a few decades ago maybe in Pakistan, but it's no longer there. And because of the urbanization, you don't see it in cities. You don't see elderly hanging together. So it's very important that, you know, places like these exist where they can just go interact with.
I think a lot also depends on the fact, Jannat, I would want to add to this, that, you know, how conducive and how homely is the environment of old homes, and, you know, how much they make you feel at home. It should just not be just a shelter home in Pakistan, so to speak. And so it should be something which should be very close to your, you know, own homely surrounding, because I think in old age that's something you really need, that comfort of being in a house and, you know, being cared for, being looked after at the end of the day. But, you know, coming back to my question, psychologically, when we talk about its negative impacts, you've told us that, you know, it tends to make people more anxious and depressed, especially those who don't want to go there, but they have to go there. But what about, you know, the children who are actually leaving their parents out there? Because I'm sure not everybody does it, you know, willingly. Sometimes they don't have the means, like Zain pinpointed, like Sir pinpointed earlier during the conversation, but they have to do it as a necessity. So of course, then that also impacts their psychological health
Of course, and it does affect them. And, you know, leaving a parent behind, or, you know, having them move out of your place, you're never going to be happy. There's always this guilt, and a lot of people tend to internalize that guilt. Even when a lot of people, when they have to migrate to other countries, they tend to harbor that guilt that, oh, our families we left behind. And they, you know, this is one thing that they sort of mention a lot of times, that, oh, you know, because of for a better future, for better lives, for our children and for ourselves, they tend to think of it as selfish act. And they are, you know, they become guilty. But it's also something that we have to understand, that if, you know, such places are in place, where the whole ecosystem is there that we were talking about earlier, then people should not be made to feel guilty about it.
Right.
Right? It can also be a choice instead of something that gets imposed on you because you lack the resources.
Of course, I think then again something which both the panelists also rightly so pointed out, then the contours of this whole thing that needs to be properly regulated, so to speak. But then coming to you, you know, I understand the fact that you're doing some really amazing work in alleviating poverty, but how precisely are you looking after the elderly population doing the same? Because at the end of the day, everything is so interlinked, being poor, not being able to, you know, look after your parents.
Fatma, we also have to see the root cause, as you rightly said, why this actually happens in our society. One of the major root cause for any issues is people living below poverty line and not being financially stable. So I think when you see families not being financially stable, because what we do is we handpick these people who want to start small businesses, we handpick them, we fund them, and then we establish their micro businesses for them, along with capacity building and training. So what this can have an effect on the society is that these people, before you know, going to such situations, if they are financially stable and if they are empowered and they are given all the right awareness about the family system and everything, and if they are able to send their kids to school, if they are able to support their parents and give a quality household to the family members, so such situations doesn't happen.
Right.
So
it's kind of a preventive
measure. So all the preventive measures has to be taken, and I think we need to create synergies between the old age homes and skill development centers with the poverty alleviation programs and rehabilitation programs also.
Right.
So as an ecosystem, it can you know, avoid people sending their parents to old age homes.
Right, and in the event that they do that, basically there's something for them to fall back on, in the sense that they can be integrated back into the society.
Exactly.
But what are the challenges that you face in this whole process? Because I think resources would glaringly be one.
Yeah. So basically challenges, of course, when we cater these people, we cater from any age, anybody who wants to start a business, from ranging from,
it can be an elderly person,
or a young person. Exactly. So you know, the issues can arise from any age factor, and you know, sometimes we have such old people coming to us and they have 6 daughters, 8 daughters, and they don't know how to support their family. If we get them a rickshaw and give them a training how to ride it and how to earn bread and butter, then you know, they have this like sir said earlier, that it's all about the power. If you give the right power to the father or the mother in the family, then they are able to take control of their whole family system. So we really have to gauge where you have to really inculcate and integrate your systems for alleviating poverty.
Right, and I think in that way the power should be divided.
Yes.
So it's a win-win for everybody.
Of course.
And nobody gets to actually exploit their power, because like they say, you know, with great power comes great responsibility. So the power should be divided then.
Because the father is always spending that money on their kids ultimately. Either he's spending on education, he's spending on, you know. So we have established around 1600 micro entrepreneurs in Pakistan. 1600 micro entrepreneurs means 1600 families. And we had 4,000 kids who were out of school and they were sent back to school after their parents have become the entrepreneurs and starting their own businesses. You can only give a quality livelihood if you're able to do so. You can never give a quality livelihood if you're not financially stable. All these issues arises ultimately how much financially.
I beg to differ though. You know, I have seen families where people have been very well educated, and you know, despite that, you know, even if they've not evicted their parents out of the house, I think their behaviors towards them might not be as respectful as they should be at the end of the day. So I think where of course economics, there's no denying to the fact that it does play a very important part.
Vital role.
There are a lot of varied factors there which could, you know, come into play depending on the nature of every case. So you wanted to add something to that?
I think that we've come into a solution. We need to put the society on a holistic track again. I think that economics, yes, has a lot to do with it, because there's a saying of the Rasulullah Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam that poverty can bring you to kufr, let alone following Islamic obligations. So yes, it is a major factor for many people. But for a lot of people, it's more about their value system. I think that Pakistan society is transitioning towards from a traditional value system to more of a chaotic system. And yes, this law can help somewhat put
in
it back on
making us,
track.
revive all those cultural values and social norms that we, typically used to have in a positive way, of course, because I think both parties need to be respectful of each other's boundaries. But in that regard, coming towards the conclusion of the show and wrapping up today's conversation, so what do you propose should be the way forward? Because this, as we all have unanimously agreed, is something which falls on the society, so to speak. You just can't completely blame the parents in this, you just can't completely blame the children in this. I think the society also has a very important role to play in, and of course by virtue of having that role, it can actually ensure in its own way that such things don't even happen to start off with.
I think that we have taken a very big step with this law. I think we have taken another step with the show itself. We bring to our viewers' homes this
Right,
concept of a holistic and value-based society.
Having these important conversations.
I think this conversation has to take place more often.
Right, sir.
In universities, in schools, in homes, in families. And I think that people like Jannat and people like Zain, who are very actively involved on the front line of social change, that social change must be accompanied by a holistic concept and awareness.
Right, sir. And I think in this regard, Islamic and religious scholars like yourself have a very important role to play too, because at the end of the day, this is something which does come from our religion, and we need to keep that basic straight. Coming to you, Zain, what would your concluding comment be? What is that one message that you would want to give to all, the children who do, unfortunately choose to evict their parents out, and also to the parents who are evicted?
I would like to say that parents are a blessing ultimately, and you must take care of them. Like our Prophet has preached us in a way, in so many ways, and in Quran also, that you can never say no to your parents. You can respectfully disagree with them, but you have to take care of them.
Right.
Secondly, I think we have to come up with a holistic, of course, plan. We have to create synergies to avoid such situations in a country like Pakistan. We have, let alone one institution cannot change this scenario. We have to build partnerships, we have to create synergies, and we have to come up with a bigger plan where everybody will play its role.
Right. I think we need to have definitely more old homes for
Yes,
those who are
more.
actually deserted this way and, left on their own. And I think in this regard, you've put forward a very valuable
Yes.
recommendation. I think the need for public-private partnership that needs to kick in as
Public-private
well.
partnership, also we need to segregate different segments of old age homes also. We need to have old age homes for trans community members. We have to have old age homes for
Very
unstable
right.
community members, and then stable community members. And then we also should have old age daycare centers for people who chose it for themselves, like our panelists said. So, so we need to create these environments who can actually contribute a better livelihood for everybody.
Right, sir, your point is noted. But coming towards you and coming towards the conclusion of the show, I think to wrap this conversation, what would be your take-home message in this regard? Like you earlier pointed out, that at the end of the day, this is something which has to do with our bringing up. This is something which has to do with our education. And by education, I just don't mean the worldly education that we seek. Education in terms of religious education, education in terms of, all the non-formal education that we do get.
Yeah. I think it's very important for children and parents both to understand their rights, the boundaries that they need to set with their children, and the children that need, the boundaries that need to be set in families, so that it never, any relationship does not become toxic. And if it does become toxic, children can take space, and old homes or these spaces should not be taken as something that they are, dumped at. It can be a blessing. It can be something that you can choose for yourself. Be aware as to what your rights and obligations are. If you're aware, if you're communicative with your children, this wouldn't come to, at the end, relationship that have that bonding. And yes, economically, if you're not, you're unable to manage your parents or anybody else, you tend to send them to old homes. But that does not mean that you abandon them or you cut ties with them. You can still visit them on daily basis. You can go there. There'd be people taking care of them there, but they'd still want their family visiting them, and that helps. So you don't have to cut ties. We see old homes as place where people don't have
they're
ties
just
to
left,
it. Yeah.
exactly.
But that is not the case, and that is something that we need to understand.
I think in that regard, we also need to change the very culture of old homes and how we, as society members, perceive them. On which
Yeah.
note, I would like to conclude today's show. Thank you so much, sir. Thank you so much, Zain, and thank you so much, Ms. Jannat, for being here with us today. Well, to conclude today's show, we generally spoke about parents' rights, and in this regard, we spoke about this extremely important piece of legislation which has been passed now, which actually basically stops children from evicting their parents forcefully out of the houses. In order to actually implement such laws in letter and spirit, we need to ensure that our societal attitudes are sensitized to actually accept and then in practice enforce such laws. And in this regard, we also need to teach young adults and children out there that just because they are busy growing up, they can't ignore the fact that they parents simultaneously are also growing old. On that note, signing off for today. Until next time, take care and Allah Hafiz.